Inyo County, a very seldom visited location outside of Death Valley National Park, to the east of Death Valley National Park. And I'll show a map to give you, orient you as to where it's located. And I am co-authoring this talk with one of my graduate students, Carolyn Mills. She's undertaking a research project to document the plants of the Nopah Range, which is here on this screen, this mountain range here that sticks up starkly above this valley landscape. It's a very rugged range, and I'll tell you about some of the discoveries that we've had there. And so a lot of her contributions are illustrated in my talk today. So first, I just want to give some background about floristic research in terms of what it is, how it contributes to our knowledge, our botanical knowledge, and why it's important for conservation. So this is one of the primary lines of research that I do that contributes to plant conservation. And essentially, floristic research is plant geography or plant exploration research, where we're going out into landscapes, we're collecting plants, taking specimens back to our home institution. We dry them, press them, and make what are called herbarium specimens. So that would, here I am in the herbarium at the California Botanic Garden, and we have these dried pressed plant specimens that document plants in space and time. So it's sort of the ultimate, the foundational knowledge we have of what plants exist on the planet, where they live, what time of year do they flower, how widespread or how rare are they, all come from botanists sort of going out into the landscape and compiling all these specimens, bringing them back and housing them in these institutions, in these metal cabinets in museums called herbaria, which are natural history collections. And so here, this is part of the process, just this series of photos. So this is Carolyn, my graduate student, and this is our field press. And we sampled this juniper on this day and took some twigs of the juniper, put it in the field press in between some newspaper. And then what we further do is, so you see there's newspaper here, and we have many specimens, and this is how we squish them and dry them, is we put them in a plant press. So people who press flowers and things like that might see this, see that this might be familiar to them. And then those plant specimens are mounted onto archival paper and housed in these natural history collections called herbaria. And it's essentially, the herbaria are catalogs for plant diversity. And they're they're distributed all across the world. Every country has a herbarium. And in our country, the herbarium of the California Botanic Garden, where I work, is the 10th largest in the country, and we have over 1.2 million specimens. So that's quite an extraordinary thing to see at the garden as well. Depending on if you all are interested in coming for a visit, we can maybe in the future arrange a behind the scenes tour. But these kinds of studies where we collect these specimens, they are what provides the foundation for understanding plant diversity in terms of what plants occur where. And this is really important in the desert because we know that it's actually a very species-rich desert that we have in California, the Mojave Desert. There's about 2,500 different kinds of plants that have been documented to our deserts, and that represents 38% of our flora of California and only 28% of the landmass. So it is actually, for a desert, we think of them as not being as species rich as areas that have more water. Our deserts actually have lots of rare species, and it's actually an area where there's a high rate of species discovery. So a lot of times we think about the plants that exist on the planet and we think we have an understanding or a pretty good catalog of what plants occur where, but we're actually still finding new species. And we're able to do that by going out and doing this exploration, collecting specimens, bringing them back, and then comparing them with specimens that have been previously collected. And sometimes we make these discoveries of species that no one has ever named before. So that's a really exciting line of research. And as over the course of my research, I've actually been able to describe 6 new plants to the California flora, 3 of them being in the desert. And so this is something I hope to continue as we add to the knowledge of the California flora. And doing floristic research in this particular region of southeastern Inyo County is really important. So I have the area here circled on a map. And so this is the state of California, and the white parts are herbarium specimens, and the black parts are areas for which no specimens exist. So we can see that the desert overall, which is this area, is generally lacking in specimens, and in particular this area where I'm working. And you could see that there are specimens collected, but they primarily line the roads. They make these straight lines, and that just represents roadside collecting. And so that indicates that we still have much to learn about plant diversity, and we could potentially discover new rare plant populations, new species, all sorts of things. It's just a very exciting area of research. And so here's a closer look of the specific study area where I'm working. This is here, this inset map shows that it is right on the boundary between California and Nevada. In fact, our eastern boundary of the study area is the California-Nevada border here. And it includes, so this is Ash Meadows Wildlife Refuge, which is just east of Death Valley National Park. If you've never visited that location, I highly recommend it. I'll have some photos of it. It's really a spectacular place to see wetlands in the desert. And then it encompasses some really interesting mountain ranges, including the Nopah Range, which is a mountain range made of limestone rock, and the Resting Spring Range, which is another mountain range that has a lot of volcanic and carbonate rock, which make for really interesting plants that live there. And then there's some intervening valleys. And then there's this really amazing feature called the Amargosa River, which is not your traditional sort of river, which I'll talk about a little bit more as we get into that. In this bounded area, that is the area I'm speaking about today, the low point is Tecopa Basin down in here, which is about 1,300 feet in elevation. And the high point in the Nopah Range is Nopah High Point, just under 6,400 feet in elevation. So that's not a huge elevational gradient, but it does, there are lots of different habitat types between the low and the high elevation points. And this is in a region that's right adjacent to Death Valley is just behind this inset map right down the way, which has the lowest point in California at below sea level, 280 feet below sea level. And just above Badwater Basin is Telescope Peak, which is in the Panamint Mountains. It's a very high elevation desert mountain range that gets to alpine. So this geographic region overall is very heterogeneous, encompasses high mountain ranges, low valleys, has, you know, snow at the highest elevations in the wintertime, and just some of the hottest temperatures on Earth occur here. As we noted this past summer, Death Valley at Badwater Basin had record-breaking heat this year. The recorded temperature was 127 degrees Fahrenheit, I believe, and it was just very hot. It might have been higher than that, 128 or so. And so when we think about this area in the context of history, where it is today and what it was like historically, so this area, I've got drawn to working in this Amargosa River Basin here because it actually has all these important wetlands which support rare plants. And the wetlands that occur there today are these vestiges of wetlands that occurred during the last ice age in what we call the Pleistocene, about 10,000 years ago. So 10,000 years ago, California was a very different landscape, and it had these major lakes and rivers that all connected to each other through this Eastern California area. So Lake Manly is Death Valley, and Death Valley was a lake filled with water. And that Tecopa Basin I spoke about was a lake called Lake Tecopa, and the Amargosa River flowed into it. So the course of the Amargosa River is pretty similar today, where it flows here from north to south through Lake Tecopa, and then it makes a U-turn into Death Valley and empties into what was Lake Manly. but all these lakes and rivers were once connected, and it formed this continuous habitat of lakes and streams that's now, they're severed. There's no connection anymore because there's far less water. And so now there are these rare plants that are still tied to wetland habitats, to streams or lakes or meadows, but they're now all disconnected from one another, and it's provided these opportunities for isolation. And now you have rare plants that are and animals that are restricted to these isolated wetland habitats throughout this landscape. And so now, because the climate has warmed and dried, so here we are at Furnace Creek at the Visitor Center on a day I visited in June 27th, and it's a very hot, dry location. There's generally hardly ever any water in Lake Manly anymore. It's a dry lake bed full of salt. And so we live in a very different climate today than it was 10,000 years ago, but there's still very many special plants and animals that live in these wetland habitats. And so here is a map that shows the Amargosa River. That is the focus of my study, which it starts here up in Nevada. This is the town of Beatty. And so it's north of that, and it's actually on the Nevada test site, and comes down into California, and I said makes a U-turn into Death Valley and empties into Death Valley. So it's not a constantly flowing river. It's dry in many portions along the way, but there are portions of the river in this area which does have perennial flow and supports fish and other kinds of rare animals and plants that I'll talk about a little bit more. So this area, this picture up top, is the area of the river where there's perennial water, and it supports all this lush vegetation, which is mostly mesquites here. And so the portion of the river that is the focus of my research is this, the portion in California that is right here near Ash Meadows. This is Ash Meadows Wildlife Refuge. So starting right here at the state border, coming down right about to the San Bernardino County line. I haven't really explored this portion where it makes a U-turn. This is where it empties into Death Valley National Park. And it can actually be a little bit challenging to get research permits in the national park, unfortunately. And so I've just really focused my research on this area. It's managed by the Bureau of Land Management largely, and has been largely understudied. And so it's such a big and expansive river, and I could study this for a lifetime. So I thought I would just focus on this area first. So I'm just going to give you all a little bit of a tour as we go along the river from north to south to orient you to the site. So the headwaters of the Amargosa River are in Yucca Mountain, which is on the Nevada test site, as I mentioned. This site has actually been identified multiple times by the Department of Energy as a potential site for nuclear waste disposal, which is very controversial, obviously, as nuclear waste disposal just generally is, but especially because it's at the headwaters of this very ecologically important river. So that is a very important conservation topic.
Well, you can talk.
And then we have the town of Beatty I mentioned here, which is just outside of Death Valley National Park and is sort of like a gateway to Death Valley National Park. And there are perennial portions of the river along here. There's actually a toad that only lives in this area of the river. And it's near this, this top photo is a place called, it's the entrance to a place called Titus Canyon, which holds a really beautiful monkey flower, the Death Valley monkey flower here, which lives on limestone rock. So this is one of my favorite areas of the park, is this area here near the Amargosa River, because this is a perennial monkey flower that lives in rock crevices in carbonate rock. It's rare. It only lives in Death Valley National Park and nowhere else in the world. And it's really tiny, actually. It's small. Oh gosh, the flower is smaller than like the tip of my thumb. I wish I had a picture with scale to indicate just how tiny that is, but it's a very interesting plant. And then as you go further south down the river, you get to this area. This is where I start, my research picks up in and around this place called Death Valley Junction. So if you ever travel to this area, this is quite an interesting place to visit. It has the Amargosa Opera House, which actually has entertainment. It has, they put on ballets and other things. It's a very, if you look it up, it has a very interesting history. But it's also home to some wetlands, which is the home of this very rare plant called the Amargosa nidowort, Nitrophylla mohabensis. And that is a plant that I'm doing a lot of research with. I'm doing monitoring to understand how the population changes from year to year, and also doing work to understand how it reproduces or when it reproduces by seed. So you see it has these little pink flowers that bloom in May. And I've tried to make seed collections of this plant for conservation purposes on a number of times. And we never get more than 100 seeds when sampling more than 50 plants, which is very low. So we're kind of interested in why this plant doesn't set very many seeds. It seems to grow primarily by underground stems. And it grows on these very salty soils. And the time when it's at its maximum growth phase, when we do its monitoring, is in July. And that's also one of the hottest times of year in this area. And so I'm out here with interns with my team in July monitoring this plant. And so we get up before dawn and to get out onto the salt flats so that we can do the monitoring before it gets too hot. We usually have to call it a day by 11 a.m. because then it's well over 100 degrees and difficult to survey. And then just near Death Valley Junction and where the Amargosa nidowort lives, actually the Amargosa nidowort also lives in Ash Meadows, is Ash Meadows Wildlife Refuge, which has these really incredible, beautiful crystal blue pools of water that support rare fish, endemic pupfish that only live in these pools and nowhere else in the world. It also has some interesting plants like the Death Valley blue-eyed grass, and about 7 plants live just in the bounds of this refuge and nowhere else in the world. That is their only home. And many of them are listed as rare, threatened, or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And one of the primary threats to this region, to Ash Meadows and all of the wetlands in this region, is that there's been a history of agriculture. You can see like little green dots on this map. I wish I could kind of zoom in, but that's agriculture where people are growing alfalfa and other crops. And then there's also increased urbanization in surrounding areas where people are pumping water out of the groundwater basin. So the water, there's a lot of water in this area and it's largely underground, and it's water that was produced during that last ice age I talked about in the slide with the lakes. So during that time, there was lots of snow, lots of rain, and it supported all these lakes. And a lot of that water went deep down underground. And that water that was laid down 10,000 years ago is surfacing today at seeps and springs in very isolated areas. So this spring, all the water that's coming out supporting the spring is ancient water. It's not water of today. And so when we draw down that water, that means we don't have any reserves because the water that is falling from the sky today can't recharge at the same rate that water is being taken out. So it's like we have a large bank account, where we got this money 100 years ago, and our modern day income is, very minuscule, but we're spending at a rate that far outpaces what we earn today. So that's the general scenario of the main conservation threat in this region, that there's what we call groundwater overdraft, that we're taking too much water out of the ground that supports these wetland ecosystems. And so Ash Meadows was designated, and they monitor the water in this area to determine how groundwater levels are changing, because it's really important to supporting all the rare plants and animals. And then when we go further down the river, there's this really beautiful village called Shoshone, which supports some interesting rare and endemic plants. There's actually a pupfish, a fish that only lives in Shoshone and nowhere else in the world, which is really neat. And this has been a really interesting conservation project for me, all the work that I'm doing here, because the woman who owns the village of Shoshone, her name is Susan Sorrells, she's actually very supportive of conservation. And it's not often that you find a private landowner who's actively wanting you to come and survey their property and find the endangered plants and animals. And so that's been really gratifying to work and engage not only with public land managers to tell them about the rare plants that occur on the land they manage, but also working with private landowners to help support the rare habitats that they have on their property. And then we go to the town of Tecopa. There's lots of interesting, so there, and it, you know, I mentioned there's wetlands here, and it's not just your typical wetland. A lot of it is warm or hot springs. So there's a lot of sort of hot water that surfaces in this area. And so this is a popular hot spring out in Tecopa. But at this very site lives an endangered vole. Only lives in these marshlands. And then also there's this rare plant called the Tecopa birdsbeak, which I'll talk about a little later, that also lives here. And then finally down to the south, as you make the U-turn into Death Valley, there's this really extensive dune system, which is pretty amazing. It's called Dumont Dunes. And it also happens to be a very popular off-highway vehicle recreational area and is heavily used and is managed specifically for recreation. And then now we're making our U-turn into Death Valley, and there's this really beautiful wetland system called Saratoga Spring, which has beautiful wetlands. And then finally, the river empties at Badwater Basin, below sea level, 282 feet. So if you've never been to Death Valley National Park, I highly recommend you visit Badwater Basin and be at the lowest point in North America. It's really interesting place. So portions of the Amargosa River were designated as wild and scenic river. About 34 miles were designated. And so this is a really important conservation element in this region that will allow for management of habitats, rare plants and animals into the future. And so I'm working with the Bureau of Land Management to give them information about the plants along this segment of the river so that they can, you know, institute better management for those rare plant resources. So over just a summary of the physical setting. So this area where I'm doing this research is in this lower part of the Amargosa Valley. It includes wild and scenic river designation. It's also part of the river where there's actual perennial flow of the river where I'm doing my research. And embedded within this area, so I talked a lot about the river, but surrounded by this area are these limestone mountain ranges. You know, I would call them there's calcareous rock, which support important plants. So that's the Nopah Range and the Resting Spring Range. And so that is sort of this varied physical setting that provides sort of the scene for really interesting plant finds, which I'll tell you about now. So this area, I know I'm talking about the desert, but let's just put this in the context across the deserts across North America. So this is the area where I've been doing this research, and it's at the northern end of the Mojave Desert. So we also have Sonoran Desert here in California. We have a large portion of the Mojave Desert in California. And we have little slivers of the Great Basin Desert. And so while this area is really firmly within the Mojave Desert, as you get to the higher elevations, you get a lot of elements of Great Basin Desert in this region. So it's sort of this transition between Mojave to Great Basin Desert that makes for interesting plant assemblages. And then here on the side, I just have some photos depicting the three deserts. So palm oases are really representative of the Sonoran Desert. Here we have a Joshua tree and some cacti and some Mojave yucca, very characteristic of the Mojave Desert. And then in the Great Basin Desert, there's a lot of sagebrush shrubs here in the low valleys. And then as you get into the mountains, you get a lot of pinyon woodland. And so these are sort of pretty characteristic photos of those three deserts. And so we're in the transition between these two. And what also makes this area very interesting is that there are many plants that are specialized to specific soils. So that's what edaphic specialization means. Edaphic specialization means plants that specialize on very specific rock or soil types. And so all the rare plants that occur in this area are very specific to a certain soil type. And they're not generalists, they're specialist plants. So there's over 40 rare plants that are restricted to this area, and about 15 of them are associated more with the wetland habitats. So they usually occur in alkali wetlands, and 11 of them are associated more with this limestone rock, like up here in the mountain ranges, and they live in rocky limestone habitats. So I've kind of set up this region, and so, you know, there's just all these interesting elements to this Amargosa River Basin, and so our goal really is to document the flora where these two major deserts come together, the Great Basin Desert and the Mojave Desert, but also happens to be the boundary between California and Nevada. And we know that state boundaries don't really tell us anything about biology, but it just so happens that I'm a California botanist, and I do tend to work up to the California boundary, and botanists in Nevada will work up to the edge of the Nevada boundary and not enter California. And so it's really important to work at these sort of jurisdictional boundaries to make sure that we can share data with Nevada, and Nevada can share data with us, and that we're learning more about the plants that are rare in this area that spans 2 states. And so we really want to fill in the gaps. You know, I showed you that map that showed that this is a black hole for herbarium specimens, and particularly the high elevations are these sort of islands of little black with little plant documentation. There's just not a lot going on there in terms of plant documentation. And also to learn about these sort of hydrological islands, these islands of wetland habitat. And overall, this will contribute to our knowledge of where plants live in the world, you know, how rare are they, how widespread are they, what are their threats, and these sorts of things. So in conducting this study, we spent a lot of time out in the field. We're out looking for plants, just walking around the desert, looking for plants. That's like my dream job. When I first got into botany, I thought, I want a job where I walk around the desert and look for plants. And so between Carolyn and myself, we've spent more than 150 field days out on the sites, and we've explored all the major habitat types. We've looked at all the different soil types. We've collected a lot of herbarium specimens, well over 2,000 herbarium specimens. And we've also looked at herbarium specimens collected in the past, and we assessed over 900 historical herbarium specimens to come up with a general checklist and understanding of what plants occur in this region. So some of the results we have found is that we have found many populations that are at the very edge of their range. So they reach their northern limit, or there's some southern limit here within this particular geographic region. We've also found just junctions between sky islands. So what that means is we have these mountain ranges that are like sky islands. They're these island floras up in the sky. You know, they're not connected. These mountains are very isolated and not connected. And so we might find a plant that occurs in our region in the Nopah Range, and the next closest record is in the Sierra Nevada, like 150 miles away. So there's these big gaps between where plants occur. And I'll show you some examples of that. And we've also found lots more populations of rare plants, which is pretty cool. So a little bit on these plants at the edge of their range. We're finding species that have, these aren't rare plants, but these are species that have broad distributions that are on the edge of their range. So it's kind of like the most southern occurrence or the most northern occurrence. And one of the examples is the barrel cactus here that I have in the photo, Phaerocactus cylindriceus. So here's the map of the barrel cactus. So the barrel cactus is a very widespread species. It occurs all across Arizona, all throughout our California deserts. here in, this is California in the Sonoran Desert, getting up into the Mojave Desert. And then we've recorded it here. And so this is really kind of the northern edge of the range for this species. And you don't find any more barrel cactus further to the north. Like this is where barrel cactus stops. And that's just quite an interesting thing. It's very abundant in this area. And so sometimes when you find plants that are kind of petering out and at the edge of the range, they're usually not very abundant. But it turns out the barrel cactus is very abundant here. So I find that to be particularly interesting. And then there's this rare plant called crucifixion thorn, Castella emeryii, which occurs primarily in the Sonoran Desert, but there's a record for it in and around the Nopah range that we're still trying to, we have the historical record for it, and we're still trying to track it down. We haven't relocated it, so it's a little bit of a mystery. There's this record over here, which is near Ridgecrest in the western Mojave Desert, but we think that one might actually be planted. So anyway, so just really cool that it's really separate from all the rest of the populations. This was a really neat find. We found this plant in the spring of 2019. And this is Astragalus coccineus, the scarlet milk vetch. It has beautiful red flowers. It's a small forb, just like a, not very tall, maybe about a foot tall. And it occurs in the transverse ranges down near where I come from. So California Botanic Garden is, in Los Angeles County, and it occurs on the north side of the mountain ranges above the LA Basin. And it occurs in the Sierra Nevada mountains and in some desert mountains in the park. But we found it in the Nopah range, which was really, it had never been found there before. So that's just a new discovery, and it's adding knowledge to where that plant lives. So you could just imagine that the desert has all those areas for which we don't have plant documentation, that if you just start exploring plants in any of those areas, you're likely to find these new kinds of records. And so next I'll talk about some plants that we found that are filling in these geographic gaps between mountain ranges. And so this is Astragalus pershii variety tinctus. It's a kind of milk vetch that has these really fuzzy pods. It's a perennial, and it has this woody taproot. You can see here, this is a specimen I took, so I dug this plant up to make it into a herbarium specimen. And it is kind of widespread and scattered all about these desert mountain ranges, but this distance between this mountain range and the star where we found it is about 150 miles. So that's not a trivial distance to kind of find this new record. And so this just, I think, goes to show that we have a lot to learn about plants and where they grow, and it requires plant exploration and going out and documenting these plants. This plant, Toxicoscordion paniculatus, is a kind of death camas. And it's a bulb plant that lives underground most of the year, and then it shoots up its flowering stalk in the spring. And it lives mostly in the Great Basin Desert to the north, but we found it at its very southern edge. So this is a Great Basin plant that we found in the northern Mojave Desert. And we actually found many, many populations of them. It's actually quite common in the mountain range. But before our study, it was never documented there before. It wasn't known from our area. And so that's just a new record that we're documenting. And some of it is like, we have all these new records and we're finding all these great things. And it's really fun to be a plant explorer in an area where someone hasn't documented plants before, because you get to claim all these wonderful discoveries. And then we've been finding lots of rare plant populations as well. So all those plants I mentioned previously, those were all very widespread species for which we're finding these new populations. But we're also finding populations of rare plants, new populations of rare plants that hadn't been documented before. So those would be plants of the alkali wetlands or the ones in the limestone mountains. Oh, wait, before I go, I want to mention this is Death Valley sage. If you ever go to Death Valley and you want to see a cool plant, this is like one of the very coolest plants to see. It's got these very spiky leaves. It blooms in April, May, and just has these really deep purple flowers with the fuzzy calyx, the sepals that surround the flower. One of my other favorite plants that is rare that we've been finding new populations of is the white bear poppy, Arctomycon miramii. This is a plant that only occurs on limestone mountains. Here is its leaves in the background, and it has these really beautiful poppy flowers and that stick above. And this rock is really, really rough. To my knowledge, we've collected seeds of the species. We have it at the Botanic Garden, but we haven't grown it. And I think it's a plant that likes very, very dry conditions and probably would not do well necessarily in gardens, maybe in a very dry rock garden. But this is a beautiful plant that I think I wish more people would be able to see it because it's so magnificent. And it only occurs in this Death Valley region. Another rare plant that I am actively working on is the Tecopa birdsbeak, Chloropyron tecopense. This is a plant that is partially parasitic and it lives off of grass. So this is its flower. And in the landscape here, I have an arrow, it's these stems. You can see a flower there and a flower there. And it's attached, the roots of it are attached to this grass, which is called alkali sacaton. And this is a plant that's rare that only lives in these alkali wetlands. You can see it's actually quite lush through here in this habitat. And the soil is actually very, very wet. So if you walk around here, as you walk, you might like slip on some mud, but it's also very, very salty. So it is a very specialized habitat that only very specific kinds of plants can grow in. And then we have what plant I mentioned earlier, one of my very favorite plants. This is the plant that takes me out to this area at least once a month. It's the Amargosa nightwort. So I go and monitor this plant on a monthly basis to look at to see how its growth is progressing. And it's federally listed as endangered. It's state listed as endangered. It's about as rare a plant as you can find in the world. It has such a very small distribution, and it's very highly threatened, as I mentioned, due to the groundwater withdrawal. So it lives on those salty soils, but those salty soils are very, very wet. And so as groundwater is overdrafted, this could very much dry its habitat. And once its habitat is dry, there's no coming back from that really, and it would cause problems for the plant, and the plant could face extinction. So it's very important that we save the water resources in this area because these very rare and endangered plants rely on it. And so this is its habitat in the wintertime or near its habitat. And you can see there's standing water here. And it's actually a very lush wetland, a desert wetland, but it is quite lush. And in this area, the nightwort occurs very near this rare plant as well, the Ash Meadows gum plant, Grindelia fraxinopratensis. And this is a plant that occurs in these alkali meadows, and it blooms late in the summer. It's not quite in bloom now. It'll probably be in bloom in a couple of weeks, and I'll be out there surveying for this plant. It's actually blooms at a nice time of year because it's really nice to do surveys out here in September and October because it's not as hot. It starts to cool down by then. Oh, this is a popcorn flower that occurs in that same habitat with the Grindelia fraxinopratensis. It's called Plagiobothri salsus, and it's an annual plant. It's very, very sweet and has these just little flowers with the yellow center. And this is a plant that I made a seed collection of. We do a lot of seed banking at our garden of rare plants so that, because there's so many rare plants in California, you know, we have 6,500 kinds of plants in California, and about a third of them are rare and only occur in California, nowhere else in the world. And seed banking is a really good strategy to essentially secure genetic diversity off-site in case something catastrophic were to happen out in the field and you needed to do some kind of restoration. And so we are actively trying to seed bank every single rare plant in the state. And so this was one I was able to do this year with funding we got from the state of California. And then there's this beautiful rare shrub, Ericameria albida, which has white flowers and occurs in the same kind of, all these are rare plants that occur in this kind of alkali meadow habitat. And this plant is really interesting and unusual. It's a shrub, Euphrosyne acerosa copperwort, which occurs in that same habitat and is rare in California. Oh, this is a Mariposa lily, Calicorta striatus, alkali Mariposa lily, which I found in these alkali meadow habitats, and it was absolutely abundant in 2019. It was probably the most glorious day of my life, walking through this meadow full of Mariposa lily. I went back to the same site this year, and it wasn't as abundant this year. So the population varies every year in terms of how dense or abundant the Mariposa lilies are. But these are plants that live from underground bulbs, and they're perennials. And in some years they just burst into flower, and other years they are not as abundant. And then I just want to briefly tell you about some of the other kinds of research we did here. So we did a BioBlitz. So that was about our floristic research and some of the rare plants, but we also do work in partnership with other agencies to document plants. And we've done a couple of BioBlitzes in the area, which are intense efforts of biological survey to record every single kind of organism that lives in an area. And so there have been 2 BioBlitzes organized in this area, organized by the Nature Conservancy, where we have found some really interesting things out on these BioBlitzes. And so one is in, one BioBlitz was in a place called Chicago Valley. And the reason we did this BioBlitz, it was under private property ownership, and the Nature Conservancy was looking at acquiring it for conservation. And so they needed to know what sorts of biological organisms lived there. And so we did a survey, and it turns out this BioBlitz took place in 2016. And now we fast forward to 2020, and the Nature Conservancy is actually in the process of purchasing this property for conservation. So this was a BioBlitz that directly led to private property acquisition for conservation and conservation action. So that's really satisfying. This area of Chicago Valley has a lot of these playa habitats, which look like they're just totally devoid of plant life. But it turns out there's actually 2 rare plants that occur in this very specific kind of playa habitat, which is like a dry lake bed. And we found this buckwheat, the Pahrump buckwheat, which is rare and only lives in this area. So it's hard to see. It's actually really hard to see in the field, but it's quite sweet plant. That's an annual. And maybe it's so rare in part because people have a hard time finding it. And then we have this Pahrump orach, Atriplex argentea variety Longra Tacoma. And some of these plants, I think, fall in the category of plants only a mother could love. You know, they're not necessarily the most showy, and they're diminutive, and they're kind of these scrappy desert plants, but they're so unique and unusual, and they only occur in these very specific areas. And that's what's drawn me to them and to support their conservation, because I really believe that in doing plant conservation, you know, we shouldn't just be protecting the beautiful Mariposa lilies because we just so love and appreciate them because they're just so strikingly beautiful, but really all the elements of the plant diversity in a region are important and deserving of protection. So I'm kind of, I guess I root for the underdog. And so I really like some of the obscure little plants of this area.
Naomi, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
How successful have you guys been at propagating? I know you're seed banking, and I don't know, do you have a department that spends a lot of time trying to propagate and keep some type of backlog of these flowers?
Yeah, we have a nursery that propagates plants for multiple purposes. So our nursery has a team propagating plants for our garden, and we also have a retail nursery, and we propagate plants for the public. But we also have a restoration nursery, and that's under my directorship. And in our restoration nursery, we're propagating some of the rarest and most unusual plants for conservation efforts. So we are growing plants for restoration. We're also just growing them to understand their growing requirements, because in doing that, we just learn a lot about plants and what, you know, especially if a plant is having difficulty in the wild and maybe it's not producing seed or something like that. And we can grow them in the greenhouse and do studies to understand, you know, what some of their issues might be. So yeah, we're definitely doing that.
Is it a pretty low success rate though, just because they are so, they require such, it's hard to imagine something growing out of a rock and then it being easy to propagate. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, it really varies species by species. Some plants are just notoriously difficult to propagate. And so we have a team and they might try 20 different methods to germinate the plant. They might do, and they do it in a very scientific way where they implement trials and they'll try different methods to see what works best before they really launch into their project. And we've been able to grow really a wide variety, a wide range of plants. And in fact, we've been able to grow some rare plants that other places haven't been able to figure out those propagation methods. And so that's something, we just have also a database with a long history of knowledge and all these historical propagation records. And we just kind of continually build on that knowledge. And so, yeah, we have some really great horticulturalist propagators, plant propagators who are really dedicated to sort of figuring out what the plant needs so it can grow it. And some of it is related to environment too, because in Claremont, the area is more humid and it's not as dry. So some of the desert plants like it really dry. And so sometimes we don't have success because they really do need to be grown in a desert environment. So that definitely happens. In which case we do partner with other groups. You know, there's Mojave Desert Land Trust and some other groups that are doing plant propagation. And so if we work out the germination protocols, we can maybe share that information and have another group actually grow the plants so we can have higher success.
And then I have one more question, please.
Sure.
When in the very beginning, you said that you had found several species that were previously unknown.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys ever partner with or have access to Native Americans sources? Because I would guess that they're not unknown to them, but then I'm so curious about that. I wondered if that your research led to that.
That's a really excellent question. And that is actually something that is very difficult to get at because for a number of reasons. So there is tons of traditional knowledge that Native Americans have that in the scientific literature that wasn't conveyed or shared. And so we do have this very sort of Eurocentric, you know, perspective on plant discovery and sort of what's known or discovered for the first time when people have been living in those landscapes and using those plants, you know, for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And a lot of that traditional knowledge is either oftentimes held within community still, and that's a wonderful thing, but there's definitely issues of needing to build relationships and trust in order to kind of work with communities and understand sort of those traditional uses and what that traditional knowledge might, you know, what discoveries might lie in terms of what we're naive to, you know, in terms of what knowledge is already present. And, but some of that certainly has been lost because there's definitely a lot of Native American groups looking to revitalize their culture and working on building knowledge that has, you know, been lost due to all the tragedies that have happened to those groups of people. So it's a really difficult thing to get at. And there are people whose scholarship really focuses on the traditional use of plants and that sort of ethnobotanical focus. And there is published accountings of that. So yes, I would say that in definitely there's been a lot of knowledge that I don't have access to from this region, just because, you know, as I'm not, you know, I don't have that historical knowledge, but definitely I would say at the high elevations in these rugged areas, you have to like really want to go up there to like specifically look at plants. Like there probably wasn't a lot of good foraging up there, or there wasn't necessarily access to important plant resources because it was just so rugged and difficult to access, that I do think that some of these rugged mountain ranges have had just very little human interaction through thousands of years. But certainly we're not the first to, kind of come across these populations or whatever, but very few people know about this. Anyway, and so this is just a group photo of folks who participated in the BioBlitz at that time. And then we did another one along the Amargosa River, along the portion of the river where there's perennial flow, to support wild and scenic river management. And in doing that, we found, again, more records of plants that hadn't been formally documented using herbarium specimens in this area, including this blue-eyed grass, Sisyrinchium halophyllum. I love blue-eyed grass. It's a really cool wetland plant. And these, along the river, these really cool habitats are supported that we call hanging gardens, which are just sort of seeps coming out along the rock walls that support these rare wetland habitats. And then here is the BioBlitz for the Amargosa River trip. And that was really fun to do, and we probably will have more BioBlitzes in the future. So to summarize, this area is just, I find so fascinating because you have these mountain ranges, which are difficult to get to find, these unique plants. And then you have these isolated wetland floras. And I really think they're an important link to our past because they tell us about past climate, especially those wetlands. And then they really kind of, hopefully will help us center what we need to do with respect to conservation now, but they might also be important refugia into the future. They are likely to continue to support rare plants into the future. And so we did find notable refugial populations in the study area. We found these species at the edge of their range. We've been finding plant populations that are kind of separated across mountain ranges and patchy habitat, and lots of endemic plants that are rare and restricted to certain kinds of substrates, soil or rock. And so overall, the study, I hope, will really facilitate plant conservation and provide information about plant diversity that really survive under adverse conditions. The one thing that I keep coming back to as I study these plants is this environment out here, whether you're in the rocky uplands or in the alkali wetlands at the bottom, in the valley floor, is that it is a very harsh environment to live out here all year. Plants are there, they're stuck there 365 days of the year. They don't move, and there's high winds, high heat. In the wintertime, it's very, very cold. It's very saline. It's just very extreme conditions, yet plant diversity persists here in the face of all this adversity. And to me, it shows just how resilient plants are and how amazing they are at living in such harsh conditions. So furthers my appreciation for plants and all that they can withstand and all their amazing adaptations to deal with harsh conditions. So we have a lot of future work to continue to do in the area. So far, we've documented about 400 different kinds of plants in this area, and we expect that list to grow. I want to continue to look at how plants might be restricted to special kinds of soil. So I'm working with my students to compile a list of plants that are restricted to the limestone rock. We're doing a lot of work along the Wild and Scenic River to support that management, and then we're going to continue with our rare plant monitoring to ensure that rare plants like the Amargosa nightwort have a future in their home. And so that's a picture of us in one of these hanging gardens. And with that, I want to thank various people who have supported my work, lots of people in the field, and those who have funded our work. So with that, if there's any other questions, I'd be happy to answer.
I just unmuted myself so I could actually say, you know, I don't know what I expected to see, but I think I was astounded at the diversity of plants that you could show us from, because when you said a plant only a mother could love, to me, the whole area sounds like an area that only someone like you goes out into every single month.
It's true. The Amargosa is a sparsely populated area. I mean, not everyone would choose to live there because it is such a very extreme environment. I mean, like, just think about living in a Death Valley National Park, and summertime it gets to, 127 degrees. And it's a very vast landscape. We're talking, to get between one site to another, it's going to be an hour drive. It's not, I'm covering actually a fairly broad geographic area. And to really kind of take in and explore this area, you have to be and the plants don't bloom at always the best time of year. Like, I'm out there in July, right, monitoring these plants. So it is really a relatively small number of dedicated individuals who are working to, and some of them, are the people on this list, not a huge list. But there are a very small number of dedicated people who really understand the specialness of this place. And it's, I would say, the most vast, relatively sort of unspoiled by modern development area I've ever worked in. And in part because I think people aren't paying attention to it. And so that in some ways that provides it conservation protection, but in other ways, as soon as someone finds a viable mineral to mine or something like that, it will be, we'll have to bring all those people together who understand the importance of this place, to ensure that we can protect it into the future.
I have a question. Thank you. First of all, thank you. That was so interesting, and thank you for sharing your enthusiasm with us. Will the air quality from the fires impact this area?
Yes, it is impacting the area. I'm actually out in the area right now. I'm doing some of the plant work, and I have a friend that I stay with out here. And it is, this morning in particular, I was actually able to smell the smoke. And so a lot of times when there's fires, especially in the Sierra Nevada, the smoke drifts east and it comes right into the Death Valley and then towards Las Vegas. Las Vegas is just east. So yes, yeah.
Do you think will it have a long range effect, or do you see?
I don't think so. I mean, once the fires will clear out, usually the air quality out here is spectacular. And one of the things I really love about this area is you have like endless sky and really big, beautiful cloud cover, big white puffy clouds. And so it is kind of, when you're out here and you can't see the sky, it's not great, but it's temporary. So I don't think it should provide any long-term impact to the area, I think.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So I'm going to say thank you for all of us. We so appreciate it. And we'll let you know when we get this all posted. And if people have questions, we'll give them your email. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. No worries. Yeah.
And
yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Naomi.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you so very much. We'll be talking soon.
Thank
Such
you.
Sure,
important work.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.